They called Lady Beatrice Ashcombe the ugliest daughter in England, and on the morning of her wedding, nearly half of London crowded into St. Aldwyn's Church to watch a ruined duke sacrifice himself for money. No one had come to pray for the bride's happiness. They came because cruelty was more entertaining when wrapped in silk, jewels, and sacred music. Every pew was filled. Aristocratic ladies whispered behind painted fans. Young gentlemen who had once wagered on whether Beatrice could be persuaded to attend a ball leaned into the aisle for a better view. They wanted to see the precise moment the bridegroom looked upon his future wife and realized that even an enormous fortune might not be enough. Beatrice stood at the back of the church without a veil. She was 29, taller and broader than fashionable society permitted a woman to be, with strong shoulders, a full figure, and black hair that had thinned visibly at both temples. A dark wine-colored birthmark spread from her right forehead across her cheek and down the side of her throat. Raised clusters of skin marked its lower edge. London had called her the Wycliffe Gargoyle, the Crimson Beast, and her father's living punishment. Beatrice had heard every name. That morning she refused to hide from any of them. Lace burned against her marked skin, but that was only part of the reason she wore no veil. For 12 years, other people had covered her face, locked her behind doors, apologized for her existence, and decided which parts of her were fit to be seen. If London intended to stare today, it would stare at the whole truth. At the altar stood Julian Vale, the newly inherited Duke of Blackthorn. At 32, he possessed an ancient title, a collapsing ancestral home, several hundred desperate tenants, and debts large enough to frighten even the most patient creditor. His father, Robert Vale, had died beneath an accusation of treason after forged government correspondence appeared to show that he had sold confidential information to foreign commercial agents. No court had convicted him, but society required no verdict before destroying a family. Blackthorn's accounts were frozen, its farmland mortgaged, and its name dragged through every newspaper in England. Julian's widowed mother had stopped leaving her rooms. His younger sister Lydia's engagement had been broken by letter. Julian had inherited the dukedom and the disgrace in the same month, discovering that a duke without money was simply a beggar whom everyone enjoyed watching fall. Beatrice's father had offered to restore everything. All Julian needed to do was marry the daughter London considered unmarriageable. As Beatrice began walking down the aisle, she watched Julian for the reaction she knew better than any prayer. The widening of the eyes, the tightening of the mouth, the quick glance away, followed by false courtesy. He did none of those things. He did not smile as if generosity were a performance. He did not pretend not to see her face. He simply met her eyes and waited. When her gown caught beneath one shoe near the final step, Julian came down from the altar before the clergyman could signal him. He extended an open hand. It was not a command or a possessive grip. It was an offer. Beatrice hesitated before placing her gloved fingers in his. Julian felt how cold they were, but made no comment. The wedding vows passed beneath a cloud of whispers. Someone laughed when Beatrice promised to honor her husband. Another guest murmured that Blackthorn Abbey must need a very expensive roof. Julian heard them. His expression remained calm, but when he spoke his vows, his voice carried far enough to silence the nearest pews. Afterward, the marriage register was placed before them. Beatrice had almost completed her new name when her father approached. Edmund Ashcombe, Marquis of Wycliffe, was tall, silver-haired, and admired throughout Parliament for the warmth of his manners. He rested one hand upon his daughter's shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of paternal affection. Beatrice recoiled so violently that the pen tore through the paper. A black line spread across the unfinished word veil. Julian looked from her terrified face to Edmund's fingers. For one instant, the Marquis tightened his grip. "A nervous morning," Edmund said with an indulgent smile. Beatrice has always found large gatherings difficult. No one questioned him. Julian said nothing in the church, but he did not forget what he had seen. Later that night, in a bedroom at Larkhaven Hall, he would find blood soaking through the back of his wife's wedding gown. When he cut open its lining, he would discover a brass key stained with her blood. And when Beatrice finally allowed the gown to fall from her shoulders, Julian would understand that the most horrifying thing about this marriage had never been her face. It was what her own father had done to the body beneath it. 3 weeks before the wedding, Julian had stood beneath a hole in the roof of Blackthorn Abbey, and watched rain fall into a silver basin that had belonged to his grandmother. The Western farms were 2 payments from foreclosure. The stable roof had collapsed during the previous winter. His mother required medicines he could barely afford, and his sister had begun secretly selling jewelry to pay household servants. Julian had dismissed half the staff and leased every acre not protected by the family entail, yet the debts continued multiplying. Edmund's invitation arrived during that storm. Wycliffe House stood in Grosvenor Square, polished and guarded like a private treasury. Edmund received Julian in a study lined with estate maps and portraits of dead Ashcombs. "I can restore Blackthorn," he said without wasting time on pleasantries. Julian remained standing. Men rarely begin with generosity unless they intend to end with a price. Edmund smiled. "Your father gave you his suspicion. His enemies taught it more effectively." At the mention of Robert Vale, something cold moved behind Edmund's eyes. He offered Julian a chair, but Julian did not take it. "My eldest daughter requires a husband," Edmund said. "You require solvency. There is little purpose in disguising either fact as romance." Julian had heard the stories about Beatrice. Every gentleman in London had. He had also seen the caricatures and understood how willingly respectable society joined a mob when the victim could not fight back. "I have not met your daughter. You know what she looks like. I know what newspapers have drawn." Edmund's smile faded slightly. "Marry Beatrice, and I will settle every registered debt attached to Blackthorn. Your farms will be released from mortgage. Your mother will receive a private allowance. Your sister will be returned to society under Wycliffe protection. In addition, certain documents connected to your father's case may become available to the Crown." Julian's composure nearly broke. "What documents?" "Evidence omitted from the original investigation. If you possess evidence proving my father was framed, release it after the marriage." Julian understood both the bargain and the threat hidden inside it. Edmund was admitting that he had influence over the truth that had destroyed Robert Vale. "I will meet Lady Beatrice before answering." Edmund's eyes hardened. "That is unnecessary. Then there will be no marriage." Beatrice received Julian in Wycliffe House's blue drawing room. She stood near a tall window with one hand resting on the back of a chair she did not use. Her dark green gown covered her wrists and throat despite the heat of the fire. She wore no powder over her birthmark. "You may stare, Your Grace," she said before he could speak. "Most men do, and at least you have been offered a fortune for the privilege." Julian closed the door behind him, but remained close enough to it that she would not feel trapped. "I asked to meet you because I will not marry a woman without first speaking to her. Did you also ask whether the woman wished to marry you? Do you?" "No." "Then we have begun with honesty." The answer surprised her. She recovered quickly. "My father tells me you are desperate. London tells you I am hideous. It appears both of us have been accurately advertised." Julian looked directly at her. "I will not insult you by claiming affection brought me here. Your father has offered to save my family, and I am considering his bargain because I have people depending upon me." "How noble." "No, necessary." "And what will happen after the ceremony when you discover that necessity is easier to tolerate at a distance?" "We will determine the shape of our marriage ourselves." A bitter amusement touched her mouth. "Men make generous promises before power is placed in their hands." "Then judge me by what I do after I receive it." Beatrice studied him, searching for mockery. "What has my father promised you besides money?" Julian told her about Robert's case. For the first time, her controlled expression changed. "He said he could produce evidence?" "Yes." "Then he knows more about your father's destruction than he has admitted. Why do you say that?" Beatrice glanced toward the door before answering. "Because my father never offers access to a secret unless he helped bury it." Julian asked what Edmund had offered her. "Larkhaven Hall," she said. The estate had belonged to her mother, Helena, and formed part of a maternal trust Edmund administered. Under the terms of that trust, Beatrice would gain full control when she married or reached her 30th birthday, whichever occurred first. "My father says that after the wedding I may finally live at Larkhaven independently." Julian caught the word immediately. "May?" Beatrice's fingers tightened around the chair. "My father considers independence dangerous for a woman of my temperament." "What temperament is that?" "The kind that asks where her money has gone." She revealed the truth gradually. Helena Ashcombe had died 12 years earlier, after falling from an upper gallery at Wycliffe House. The coroner called it an accident. Beatrice, then 17, had heard her mother and father arguing shortly beforehand. Helena accused Edmund of stealing from Beatrice's inheritance and paying men to falsify public records. After Helena died, Beatrice repeated what she had heard. Edmund declared that grief had unbalanced her mind. Dr. Gideon Harcourt diagnosed female hysteria and ordered periods of what he called therapeutic seclusion. Every time Beatrice insisted upon her memory, the treatment became more severe. "I was told that my certainty proved my illness," she said. Eventually, silence became the only answer that did not lead to another locked room. Julian saw no instability in her. He saw caution sharpened by long practice and anger pressed beneath discipline. "Why accept this marriage rather than wait until you turn 30?" he asked. "My father has already prepared a petition claiming I am mentally incapable of managing the trust. If the petition succeeds, my birthday will change nothing. Marriage to a duke creates complications he cannot control as easily. You believe I can protect you?" "No," Beatrice said. "I believe becoming your legal responsibility may be less dangerous than remaining his." It was not trust, but it was the most honest reason Julian had heard. He accepted Edmund's bargain the following morning. Beatrice accepted for reasons of her own. Neither understood that Edmund had selected them because he intended one to die and the other to hang. For 12 years, Edmund had treated Beatrice's maternal fortune as a private bank. He funded failed railway ventures, bribed political allies, purchased newspaper loyalty, and concealed personal debts through companies registered under other men's names. Helena had discovered the fraud shortly before her death. Edmund's solicitor, Silas Crowther, helped falsify the accounts and arrange Beatrice's medical confinement. Now Beatrice's marriage would force an independent audit. Edmund and Crowther constructed a solution. A limited portion of Beatrice's trust would settle Blackthorn's debts, establishing Julian's financial motive. Within several months, Beatrice would die from a poison-producing symptoms of heart failure. Evidence would be planted in Julian's rooms. Society would remember that he had married a wealthy woman he could barely tolerate. Crowther had inserted a secret provision into the settlement, returning the trust to Wycliffe control if Beatrice's husband were convicted of causing her death. Julian was perfect, because the Vale name was already stained by treason. Beatrice was perfect, because Harcourt's medical reports would allow any warning she gave to be dismissed as delusion. Edmund expected the world to see a desperate duke who murdered an unwanted wife. No one would look closely enough to notice the father controlling both the money and the evidence. On the night before her wedding, Beatrice found the first secret Helena had successfully left behind. Her mother's ivory sewing box had been returned from storage among several possessions destined for Larkhaven. Beatrice remembered the painted violets on its lid and the crack across the small mirror inside. Beneath the thread tray, she discovered a false bottom. A brass key lay inside, wrapped in faded blue ribbon. 4 words had been written on the cloth in Helena's hand: "Where the lark cannot sing." Beatrice immediately thought of the rosewood music cabinet in the West Gallery. 7 carved larks decorated its doors, but one bird's beak was closed. Helena had kept private papers there. Her will required the cabinet to be transferred to Larkhaven upon Beatrice's marriage, though Edmund had delayed the transfer for years. Beatrice could not risk opening it before the wedding. The gallery was watched, and discovery would destroy her only chance. Instead, she stitched the key inside the lining of her wedding bodice, hiding it behind a strip of boning. She had barely cut the thread when her bedroom door opened. 2 of Edmund's men entered without knocking. His private secretary, Mr. Pike, remained in the corridor. They searched her desk, trunks, mattress, wardrobe, and sewing box. One man seized her arms, while the other demanded to know what she had taken from the West Gallery. Beatrice refused to answer. They were careful not to strike her face. Visible injuries would invite questions at the church. They twisted her arms behind her and forced her against the bedpost. The hidden key pressed through the lining and cut beneath her right shoulder blade. Blood dampened her shift. Still, she told them nothing. 12 years of confinement had taught her exactly how much pain she could endure without giving an enemy what he wanted. By morning, the bruises were hidden beneath sleeves. The cut had dried against the fabric. Beatrice walked through St. Aldwyn's carrying her mother's final secret against her ribs. The carriage journey to Larkhaven passed mostly in silence. Beatrice held her wilting bouquet across her lap, breathing carefully. Julian watched her protect her right side. "You are in pain. I am wearing a gown designed by a man who believes women have no need for lungs. That is not the only reason." Her gaze lifted. "You observed a great deal for a husband who intends to remain politely distant. I promised honesty, not indifference." Beatrice looked out the window. Julian continued, "You flinched when your father touched you. You have been bleeding since before the ceremony." Her spine became rigid. "You need not perform composure for me," he said. "There is no audience in this carriage." "There is always an audience. Sometimes it consists of only one person, but one is often enough." Julian did not press her again. He understood that questions could become another kind of confinement, when the person being questioned had no safe answer. Larkhaven appeared near dusk, beyond rows of copper beech trees. It was smaller than Blackthorn Abbey, but graceful, with pale stone walls and tall windows reflecting the evening sky. Beatrice stared at it as if she were seeing a place from a dream. "When were you last here?" Julian asked. "The summer before my mother died." "Your father kept you away from your own property for 12 years? He said the memories disturbed me." Julian watched the iron gates close behind their carriage. He wondered whether they represented the freedom Beatrice imagined, or merely another boundary Edmund expected to control. The staff had prepared the traditional wedding night arrangements: warmed water, a high fire, wine, candles, and a lady's maid waiting to remove the elaborate gown. Beatrice dismissed the maid at the bedroom door. "I will manage alone." The girl protested that the back fastenings could not be reached without help. Beatrice's refusal became sharper. Julian heard the exchange from the adjoining sitting room but did not interfere. Nearly an hour later, he saw the maid returning down the corridor with a frightened face. She whispered to the housekeeper that there was blood on the Duchess's gown. Julian crossed to Beatrice's door and knocked. No answer. "Beatrice, your maid saw blood. I will not enter without permission, but tell me whether you require a physician." A long silence followed. "Not Dr. Harcourt," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than Julian had ever heard it. "I will not summon him. May I come inside?" He heard the bolt move. When Julian entered, Beatrice stood beside the bed, with one hand braced against a post. Her gown hung loose from one shoulder. She had opened most of the fastenings, but could not reach those across the middle of her back. Blood stained the ivory silk beneath her right shoulder blade. Then Julian saw what surrounded it. Pale scars encircled both wrists. Similar marks crossed her ankles. Narrow lines ran over her shoulders, too regular to come from an accident. Fresh finger-shaped bruises darkened her upper arms. For one blinding second, rage emptied his mind. Beatrice saw the change in his face and mistook it for revulsion. "You may leave," she said. "I expected you would." Julian lowered himself to one knee several feet away. "May I come closer?" The question startled her. "You may look. I no longer possess the strength to hide it. I asked whether I may help." Beatrice stared at him, as though no man had ever recognized the distinction. At last, she nodded. Julian approached slowly. He saw the sharp outline beneath the torn lining. There is something inside the gown. A key. Beatrice attempted to pick up her embroidery scissors, but her hands shook too badly. "My father's men searched my room last night. They believed I had taken it from the West Gallery. Did they cause these bruises? You already know the answer." Julian took the scissors only after she offered them. "May I open the seam?" "Yes." He cut through the stitches and freed the brass key. Its edge was stained with dried blood. Beatrice explained the sewing box, Helena's message, and the music cabinet. "I believe my mother hid evidence before she died. My father has kept me confined because he knows I heard their argument." Julian placed the key where she could see it. "Who caused the older scars?" Her face became still. "Dr. Harcourt called it restraint therapy. My father told a court I suffered violent delusions. They strapped me to a bed whenever I refused to say my mother's death was an accident." "You were 17. That did not make the straps softer." Julian collected clean water and linen himself. When he returned, he knelt again. "May I clean the cut?" Beatrice nodded. He warned her before every touch. When her body tightened, he stopped. When her breathing steadied, he continued. The room held only firelight, the quiet movement of water, and the most careful touch Beatrice had received since Helena died. She found gentleness more difficult to endure than pain. Pain confirmed everything she understood about the world. Gentleness threatened to prove that another world had always been possible. "You are very quiet," Julian said. "I am reconsidering the many ways I expected this evening to proceed." "Was I meant to be crueler? You were meant to leave after seeing the scars. Most men would request an annulment before breakfast. Then it is fortunate that I have never allowed most men to make my decisions." When the bandage was secured, Julian moved away, rather than treating permission once given as permanent. "I knew what your face looked like when I married you, Beatrice. I did not know that someone had spent 12 years trying to break you. And now that you know? Now I intend to discover why your father is frightened of that key." She searched his expression for disgust or pity, and found neither. "You believe me? I believe your injuries. I believe Edmund admitted control over evidence concerning my father, and I believe powerful men do not send servants to hurt their daughters over meaningless objects." Julian stood. "I will sleep in the adjoining room. The connecting door will remain locked from your side. Tomorrow, we will find a physician with no connection to Wycliffe. Afterward, we will open your mother's cabinet. What if it contains nothing? Then we will know. And if it contains enough to destroy my father?" Julian looked at the blood-stained key. "Then he should have considered that before placing you in a marriage that allowed you to leave his house." Edmund's reach arrived at Larkhaven 4 days later in the form of Dr. Harcourt. He came without invitation and brought 2 attendants. "Lord Wycliffe instructed me to examine Lady Beatrice following the strain of the wedding." Julian stood in the entrance hall, blocking access to the stairs. "My wife has not requested an examination." "Your Grace, you have known the lady less than a month. Her father and I have managed her condition for 12 years. You restrained a grieving girl until leather cut through her skin." Harcourt's expression changed. "Certain treatments are distressing, but medically necessary. Then you will welcome an independent physician's review of the scars and your records. Lady Beatrice is prone to fabricating accusations." A voice came from the staircase. "Lady Beatrice is present," Beatrice said. She descended slowly, one hand resting on the railing. Harcourt adopted the soothing tone that had haunted her nightmares. "My dear, return to your room. Excitement is dangerous for you." Beatrice stopped on the final step. Julian did not speak for her. "You are dismissed from my service," she said. "I do not consent to an examination today or at any future time. Your father appointed me. This estate belonged to my mother and now belongs to me." Harcourt glanced at Julian, expecting him to overrule her. Julian opened the front door. "You heard the Duchess." Harcourt left, but the victory shook Beatrice. "He has never gone when I told him no," she admitted after the door closed. "He did not leave only because I said it. Then, we make certain that your refusal receives the same force next time, whether I am present or not." Julian found Dr. Samuel Reed in York, a physician with no political ties to either family. Reed examined Beatrice with a female nurse present, documented every scar, and stated that nothing in her speech or behavior supported Harcourt's claims of delusion. He also observed that several older injuries matched prolonged restraint rather than protective medical treatment. It was the first record written about Beatrice's body that did not belong to her father. Life at Larkhaven gradually assumed a fragile rhythm. Beatrice took breakfast alone for 3 mornings. On the 4th, Julian joined her without announcing that he intended to make it a habit. By the 2nd week, they were arguing over estate ledgers. Beatrice discovered that tenants had been charged repeatedly for repairs never completed. A bridge listed as rebuilt twice remained close to collapse. Payments for grain went to companies that did not exist. "Who taught you estate management?" Julian asked. "My mother began. My father stopped the lessons after her death. And the rest? The library contained books. He locked my room, not my mind." Within 3 weeks, Beatrice recovered enough missing revenue to reduce rents on several farms. Tenants who expected an absent aristocratic owner began finding their duchess in cottages, barns, and muddy fields, asking why roofs had leaked for years. Julian's respect grew independently of the pity she feared. She was exacting, practical, and unwilling to accept tradition as an explanation for incompetence. Every discovery revealed how thoroughly Edmund had underestimated the daughter he imprisoned. Smaller moments changed the marriage more quietly. Beatrice avoided the delicate gilt chairs in the drawing room because she feared one might break beneath her. She never admitted it. Julian noticed and replaced 2 with solid walnut chairs from the library. When Beatrice confronted him, he said furniture ought to survive being used. "You could have asked," she replied. "I thought asking would embarrass you. Deciding for me is not the same as sparing me." Julian apologized and asked whether she wanted the chairs removed. She tested one before telling him to leave them. When a London dressmaker discussed disguising Beatrice's figure as if she were not in the room, Julian almost dismissed the woman. He stopped himself and allowed Beatrice to do it. "I require clothing," she said, "not an engineering project designed to make me disappear." She employed a village seamstress who fitted gowns to the body she possessed, rather than the body fashion demanded. Julian's sister Lydia arrived soon afterward, bringing energy and fierce loyalty. Her engagement had collapsed after Robert Vale's disgrace, and she understood what it meant to be punished for another person's accusation. Within a day, she had attached herself to Beatrice. When a visiting countess asked what a woman of such unusual dimensions could possibly wear, Beatrice answered, "Whatever I choose." Fortunately, fabric possesses greater flexibility than your imagination. Lydia waited until the countess left before collapsing into laughter. One rainy afternoon, Lydia persuaded Julian to teach Beatrice to dance in Larkhaven's long gallery. Beatrice refused twice, before Julian began humming a waltz badly enough that she entered merely to stop him. She stepped hard on his foot during the first turn. "My foot has received more attention from you than I have since our wedding," he said. "It has demonstrated greater courage." A real laugh escaped her. The sound surprised Beatrice so much that she covered her mouth. Julian went still. "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" "As if I have performed some miracle. I was only thinking that I would like to hear it again." Her expression tightened. Julian immediately corrected himself. "Not because you owe me happiness. You owe this house nothing of the kind." The restraint in his apology affected her more than the compliment. She laughed again deliberately. From that day forward, Julian listened for the sound without asking for it. During their first formal dinner, Beatrice's glove split at an old seam, revealing the marked skin of her hand before a table of guests. Conversation faltered. Beatrice felt the old instinct to disappear. Without speaking, Julian removed both of his gloves and continued discussing the harvest. He made no announcement of support. He simply removed the visible difference between his bare hands and hers. Beatrice completed the dinner without replacing her glove. That night, she told him the gesture mattered precisely because he had not turned it into a performance. The fragile peace ended when Beatrice's maid, Nora Ellis, drank from a cup of evening chocolate intended for her mistress and collapsed beside the hearth. Nora had quietly begun tasting Beatrice's drinks after hearing about the nighttime search at Wycliffe House. Within minutes, her breathing became shallow and her skin turned cold. Julian refused to summon Harcourt. He rode through freezing rain to fetch Dr. Reed while Beatrice remained beside Nora's bed. Reed identified foxglove poisoning and worked through the night to keep her heart beating. Nora survived, though fever and weakness held her for 2 days. Beatrice did not leave her side. "It was meant for me," she said when Julian brought food she would not eat. "Someone inside this house is reporting to my father. Larkhaven was never a refuge. It is only another cage with finer furniture." Julian set down the tray. "Then we stop waiting for your father to decide whether you are safe." Something had changed in his voice. The courteous stranger she married had become a man whose anger now belonged to her cause. "What do we do?" she asked. "We open Helena's cabinet. Then we learn exactly what Edmund is trying to kill you to protect." The rosewood music cabinet arrived at Larkhaven the following morning under the supervision of Beatrice's independent solicitor. Edmund had attempted to keep it at Wycliffe House by claiming it contained Ashcombe family documents. Helena's will named the cabinet specifically, and refusing its transfer would have required Edmund to identify the supposedly private contents before trustees. Beatrice waited until Nora's condition stabilized. That evening, she and Julian entered the West Music Room alone. 7 carved larks decorated the cabinet doors. Beatrice inserted the brass key into the main lock. It opened the upper compartment, revealing music, childhood letters, and a miniature portrait of Beatrice at 10 years old. The lower drawer remained sealed. The key did not fit. Beatrice's hope collapsed. He changed the lock. Julian examined the faded ribbon that had wrapped the key. Where the lark cannot sing, 6 carved birds had open beaks. The 7th was silent. Beatrice pressed its closed beak. A hidden spring released. and the back panel shifted forward. Behind it lay a leather ledger, bundles of correspondence, bank receipts, and a sealed statement addressed to Beatrice. Her hands trembled as she unfolded Helena's final letter. "My dearest bird, if you have found this, then I failed to protect you openly. Do not inherit my silence, merely because it kept me alive a little longer. Your father has taken money from your trust, but the theft is only the beginning. He has destroyed an innocent family to hide what he has done. Trust the figures marked beneath the names of birds. Find Robert Vale." Julian read his father's name twice. The leather ledger appeared to contain ordinary household accounts: candles, coal, flour, ribbons, laundry, and repairs. But Helena had underlined particular words in brown ink. Beatrice remembered a counting game from childhood. After the name of a bird, read every seventh word. Together, she and Julian began decoding the entries. Purchases of coal concealed withdrawals from Beatrice's trust. Laundry expenses represented payments to newspaper editors. Candles recorded bribes to government clerks. Page by page, Helena revealed how Edmund had stolen from his daughter and used the money to purchase political influence. Then Julian found payments made shortly before Robert Vale's disgrace. The money went to the editor, who first printed the accusations, and to an official who authenticated the forged correspondence. Helena's letters showed that Robert had discovered Edmund selling advance information about tariffs and railway contracts to foreign investors. Edmund destroyed him before he could testify. "My father was framed," Julian said, his voice flat with fury. "Your father destroyed my family to silence a witness." Exhausted and frightened, Beatrice mistook his rage for accusation. "Do you believe I knew? I did not say that. You did not need to. I see it in your face. I am looking at the evidence. You are looking at an ashcombe because the guilty one is not in this room." She reminded him that she had been 17, imprisoned, and drugged when Robert Vale fell. Julian heard the wound in her words and recognized what he had done. He apologized without excuse. "You are not responsible for your father any more than I am responsible for mine. I allowed grief to become accusation." Beatrice did not forgive him immediately. Julian did not demand that she do so. Over the following days, the ledger revealed a conspiracy larger than either expected. Helena had worked with her cousin Margaret Fenwick and a government clerk named Thomas Arden. Margaret had vanished from society 6 years earlier. Arden was believed dead. Robert Vale had died disgraced. Edmund had methodically removed everyone who could explain the evidence. Using Lydia's former governess as an intermediary, Beatrice traced Margaret to Scotland and sent a coded request. While they waited for a reply, the household investigation identified an assistant housekeeper receiving payments from Mr. Pike. The woman admitted reporting Beatrice's movements but denied knowing about the poison. Beatrice dismissed her and gave her testimony to a magistrate. "You sold information about a woman whose father had already confined her," Beatrice said. "You did not need to pour the poison to understand that you were helping him reach me." The captured delivery records connected the poisoned chocolate to one of Edmund's servants. For the first time, they possessed evidence of a present crime rather than only Helena's account of the past. Edmund answered with a private offer to Julian: return the ledger, permit Beatrice to be confined quietly, and receive complete restoration of Blackthorn, along with public proof of Robert Vale's innocence. Julian refused in writing before 3 witnesses. He did not tell Beatrice, fearing his loyalty would sound like another man congratulating himself for treating her as human. Margaret's response arrived during a winter storm. She had preserved 1 page of Helena's coded evidence and a sworn account of the night Helena died. Edmund had threatened to accuse Margaret's brother of embezzlement unless she left England. Margaret had seen Silas Crowther enter Helena's room carrying a medicine bottle. Later, she heard Helena accuse Edmund of stealing Beatrice's fortune and framing Robert Vale. Then came breaking glass and a scream. When Margaret reached the upper gallery, Helena lay on the floor below. Edmund stood at the railing while Crowther held an empty medicine bottle. Helena was still moving, but Edmund ordered Margaret away and delayed calling for help. The statement did not prove that he pushed his wife, but it proved he had lied about the circumstances surrounding her death. Beatrice read the letter twice. "I believed Margaret abandoned me because she was ashamed to be connected to me." Julian sat across from her without reaching for her. Your father made isolation look like rejection. That allowed him to convince you everyone eventually chose safety over you. Did they not? Some did, Julian said. I will not. Beatrice wanted to believe him. Before she could answer, the estate bell began ringing. Smoke rolled beneath the west music room door. Someone had poured oil behind the paneling. Helena's cabinet, the ledger, and every remaining piece of evidence were already surrounded by fire. Sigh mine. Beatrice did not wait for Julian to stop her. She wrapped a wool shawl across her mouth and ran toward the west corridor before the servants understood what she intended. The fire had begun inside the walls, spreading through the dry timber with unnatural speed. Flames crawled across the music room ceiling, while burning fragments of wallpaper fell like black snow. Helena's cabinet stood at the far end of the room. The ledger remained inside its hidden compartment, along with Margaret's statement, the bank receipts, and every letter capable of clearing Robert Vale's name. Beatrice knew she should turn back. She also knew that if the evidence burned, Edmund would once again control the truth. He would call the poisoning an accident, Margaret a liar, and Helena's death the fantasy of an unstable daughter. 12 years of confinement would become the only history anyone remembered. Beatrice lowered her head and crossed the room. Heat struck her face. She pressed the silent carved lark, opened the hidden panel, and swept the ledger and papers beneath her shawl. Behind her, part of the ceiling collapsed across the main doorway. Sparks filled the room. She turned toward the windows, but iron catches held them shut, and swollen wood prevented them from opening. Smoke thickened until she could barely see. "Beatrice!" Julian's voice came from beyond the fallen beams. "I have the ledger!" she shouted. "There is no way through!" Julian appeared between the flames with a wet cloth over his mouth. He climbed across the fallen timber, just as another section of ceiling cracked. "You should not have followed me," Beatrice coughed. "You entered a burning room. So did you." A beam fell. Julian pushed her away and took the blow across his left shoulder. He dropped to one knee. Beatrice pulled at him, but his arm hung uselessly. The main entrance was now completely blocked. As a child, Beatrice had visited Larkhaven with Helena during the summers. Musicians performing in the West Room entered through a narrow service passage behind the instrument cupboard, so that guests would not see them crossing the formal hall. Beatrice had once hidden there during a game. She forced herself to remember the room as it had looked 12 years earlier, rather than as it looked through smoke. There is another door. She dragged aside the burning remains of a curtain and reached the large cupboard. It had been secured to the floor, but the fire had weakened one side. Julian braced his uninjured shoulder against it. Together they pushed until the wood tore free. A narrow door appeared behind it. The iron latch lifted, but the door had swollen inside its frame. Beatrice struck it with her shoulder. It did not move. Flames spread across the carpet behind them. Julian tried to stand and nearly collapsed. "Take the evidence and go," he said. "I am not leaving you. If the smoke takes us both, your father wins. He has already taken my mother. He will not use her evidence to make me abandon my husband." She struck the door again. Pain shot through her arm. Julian added his weight. The frame cracked, and freezing night air rushed through the opening. Beatrice pulled Julian into the passage, supporting his injured side across her shoulders. The corridor descended beneath the chapel and emerged behind a stone wall in the yew garden. They reached the open air moments before the music room windows exploded outward. Servants carried Julian toward the old estate chapel because the main house had filled with smoke. Beatrice followed with Helena's ledger pressed beneath her cloak. Her burned palms throbbed, and every breath scraped her throat, but she refused to release the papers until Dr. Reed arrived. The chapel had not been used for worship in a generation. Moonlight entered through broken windows, falling across an empty altar and rows of dust-covered benches. Julian sat against the stone wall, while Beatrice examined his shoulder. "It is not broken," he said. "You cannot know that. I can move my fingers. You also said we should leave you inside a burning room. Your judgment is presently unreliable." Despite the pain, Julian almost smiled. "There is the woman I married." The words quieted them both. Outside, men shouted as they carried water from the frozen pond. Orange light flashed through the chapel windows. Beatrice's hands began shaking only after the immediate danger passed. She had been too occupied to feel fear inside the fire. Now every breath brought the memory of collapsing timber and locked doors. Julian saw the change in her, but did not reach for her. "You are outside," he said. "The chapel door is open. No one is preventing you from leaving." Beatrice focused on the open doorway until the panic loosened. Then she moved closer by her own choice and sat beside him. "I married you to save Blackthorn," Julian said, after a long silence. Beatrice looked toward him. "This seems an unusual time to repeat something we both know. I need you to know the rest." The fire crackled in the distance. "I told myself that courtesy would make the bargain honorable. I intended to give you a comfortable house, speak kindly, and keep my heart outside the marriage. Duty seemed safer because duty asks nothing that cannot be written into a settlement. And now I would watch Blackthorn fall stone by stone before allowing your father to rebuild it with your imprisonment." Beatrice's breathing became still. Julian continued, "I do not want your gratitude because I cleaned a wound or sent Harcourt away. Those were things any decent man should have done. Gentleness should never have been rare enough to become a debt. Then what do you want? You." The single word remained between them. Not the trust, not Larkhaven, not your father's influence. "I want the woman who recovered years of stolen rents in 3 weeks. The woman who frightens dishonest stewards and defeats countesses with complete sentences. The woman who entered a burning room for the truth and then refused to leave me behind." Beatrice lowered her eyes. "You have not mentioned my face. I have not forgotten it." Julian waited until she looked at him again. "I know every line of your face. I search for it when you leave a room. When I heard the alarm tonight, the possibility that I might never see it again frightened me more than losing every document in that cabinet." Beatrice had spent her life hearing compliments shaped like apologies. Relatives called her intelligent when they meant that beauty was impossible. Men described her as brave when they meant unfortunate. Women told her she possessed character because they believed no one could love her body. Julian did not tell her society was blind or insist the birthmark was secretly beautiful. He told her the truth. He knew exactly what she looked like and wanted to see her again. "If I ask you to stop," she whispered, "will you?" "Immediately. If I change my mind, then you have changed your mind. And if I do not know what I want, I will wait until you do." Beatrice closed the distance herself. Their first kiss was slow and cautious. When she pulled away, Julian did not follow. He remained still until she touched his face and kissed him again. No father's settlement explained it. No debt required it. The ruined chapel, filled with smoke and winter air, became the first place in their marriage where they chose each other freely. Dr. Reed reached Larkhaven before dawn. Julian's shoulder was badly bruised but not broken. Beatrice's palms required bandaging, and both had inhaled enough smoke to make speaking painful. The West Music Room was destroyed, but stone walls prevented the fire from consuming the entire house. Investigators discovered oil-soaked cloth hidden behind the paneling. This had not been an accident. More importantly, one of the men hired to start the fire was captured near the northern orchard. A groom found him with burned sleeves, a pouch of Crowther's money, and a second bottle of lamp oil. Facing charges of arson and attempted murder, the man identified Silas Crowther as the person who hired him. Crowther disappeared from London that same morning. Customs officers detained him at Dover while he attempted to board a ship bound for Calais. He carried forged travel papers, government bonds purchased under false names, and a locked dispatch case. When the case was opened under warrant, investigators found private copies of deeds, falsified medical petitions, altered trust accounts, and correspondence documenting more than 20 years of crimes committed for Edmund. Crowther had preserved the evidence as protection against the employer he never trusted. His planned escape transformed that protection into proof. Edmund reacted by attacking Julian's weakest point. Newspapers published new accusations against Lydia, claiming she had helped Robert Vale transmit government information before his death. The supposed letters were obvious forgeries to anyone familiar with her handwriting, but truth traveled more slowly than scandal. Invitations were withdrawn. A widowed baronet who had shown interest in Lydia stopped visiting. When she attempted to laugh about it at breakfast, her hand shook badly enough to spill tea. Beatrice found her later in the unused nursery, crying beside a covered cradle. "This is happening because Julian married you," Lydia said, then immediately looked ashamed. "Forgive me. I did not mean... You meant that my father is using you to punish us. That is true. Julian could make it stop by returning the ledger. Temporarily. Perhaps temporary safety is better than none. Beatrice sat beside her. I obeyed my father for 12 years because I thought each surrender might satisfy him. Instead, every surrender taught him which threat worked. If Julian gives him the ledger to protect you today, he will threaten you whenever he wants something tomorrow. Men like Edmund do not become satisfied. They become educated. Lydia wiped her face. Then what do? We make the forgery more dangerous to publish than the truth. Beatrice and Lydia demanded that the newspaper release the original letters for examination. When the editor refused, Beatrice purchased space in 3 competing publications and offered to pay for independent handwriting experts chosen by the editor himself. She also announced that any evidence establishing Lydia's involvement would be submitted voluntarily to a magistrate. The challenge forced the newspaper into a choice: produce documents that could be exposed as forged or admit that it possessed nothing. Within a week, the editor withdrew the accusation and blamed an unnamed source. Investigators traced the payment for the article to one of Edmund's political accounts. Lydia's name was cleared without Julian negotiating with her attacker. The victory mattered to Beatrice because no duke had rescued them. 2 women whom Edmund considered useful weaknesses had turned his weapon into evidence. Nora recovered slowly from the poisoning and complained that surviving had made everyone unbearably protective. When Beatrice instructed her to rest, Nora replied, "With respect, Your Grace, you entered a burning room after marrying a duke and uncovering a conspiracy within 1 month. I will not accept lectures from you concerning sensible behavior." Julian laughed so hard that his injured shoulder hurt. Beatrice promoted Nora to personal secretary once she recovered, allowing her to supervise correspondence relating to the inquiry. The position gave Nora independence and placed the person who had nearly died from the poison in control of organizing evidence against those responsible. Larkhaven's remaining servants were interviewed individually. Several confessed that Edmund's secretary had paid them for harmless information, but only the dismissed assistant housekeeper had allowed strangers into the kitchen. Her testimony identified the servant who delivered the poisoned chocolate. The man was arrested after attempting to hide at an Ashcombe hunting lodge. Under questioning, he admitted receiving the packet from Crowther, but insisted Edmund personally ordered that Beatrice's cup be served after Julian left the house. The conspiracy could no longer be dismissed as an old dispute about money. While Julian recovered, the intimacy between him and Beatrice deepened slowly. She began visiting his room in the evenings, sometimes to discuss evidence and sometimes without inventing a reason. He never treated the kiss in the chapel as permission for anything that followed. Beatrice decided whether the door remained open. She decided when they sat close enough to touch. On the first night she stayed until morning. Julian allowed her to extinguish each candle herself, so darkness would be something she chose, rather than something imposed upon her. When an unexpected sound in the corridor caused her to freeze, he did not insist she was safe. He opened the door, showed her the empty passage, and waited. Their marriage became intimate through hundreds of decisions too small for society to understand. Beatrice learned that desire did not have to arrive carrying fear. Julian learned that patience was not passive. It was an active refusal to take what had not been freely offered. Neither called the process healing, because some wounds remained. They called it trust. Edmund sent his final offer 2 weeks before the formal inquiry. This time, he came to Larkhaven personally. Julian received him in the library, while Beatrice listened from the open passage outside. Edmund placed a prepared statement on the desk. It declared that Beatrice suffered a violent delusion, accidentally poisoned her maid, and started the fire while attempting to destroy documents proving her instability. Julian needed only to sign. In return, Edmund promised to settle every remaining Blackthorn debt, restore Robert Vale's reputation, secure Julian a government appointment, protect Lydia permanently, and agree to a quiet annulment. "You married her for money," Edmund said. "Do not become sentimental because she survived long enough to interest you." Julian read the document. For 2 years, he had dreamed of clearing his father. He imagined his mother returning to church without whispers. He imagined Lydia free from inherited shame and Blackthorn's farms restored. Edmund had designed the offer carefully, placing every person Julian loved on one side and Beatrice alone on the other. "You miscalculated," Julian said. "Did I? You still believe my wife is alone." He tore the statement in half. Edmund's polite mask slipped. She will destroy you. No. She exposed what you destroyed before either of us entered this marriage. No one will believe a marked, hysterical woman over the Marquis of Wycliffe. Julian opened the library door. Beatrice stood beyond it. You were listening, Edmund said. I spent 12 years listening through locked doors, she answered. It seemed appropriate that this one should remain open. Edmund moved toward her with the confidence of a man who had never accepted that his daughter could deny him. Julian stepped between them, but Beatrice touched her husband's arm. No, let him see that I am not hiding behind you. Julian moved aside while remaining close enough to intervene. Edmund stared at the daughter he once controlled through a look or a physician's threat. She wore a gown fitted honestly to her figure. The birthmark across her face and throat remained uncovered. Her sleeves ended above the wrists, revealing the scars Harcourt had left. You would ruin your own family? Edmund demanded. You ruined it when you decided the family consisted only of you. Everything I did protected the Ashcombe name. You stole from your child, killed the woman who discovered it, destroyed an innocent man, and prepared to hang my husband for my murder. Beatrice's voice never rose. If that is the Ashcombe name, it deserves no protection. Edmund glanced toward Julian. She will turn on you when her madness changes direction. Beatrice answered before Julian could. That warning would be more convincing if every person I supposedly imagined had not eventually appeared carrying your money. Edmund left after promising they would regret humiliating him. The moment the door closed, Beatrice's knees weakened. Julian offered his hand without taking hers. She placed her fingers in his and remained standing. The inquiry convened at Westminster House on a gray winter morning. It had originally been called to resolve disputed management of Beatrice's maternal trust. Crowther's arrest, the poisoning, and the Larkhaven fire transformed it into something far larger. Magistrates, trustees, physicians, journalists, and members of both families crowded into the chamber. Edmund expected the old hierarchy to protect him. Men had trusted his title for decades. They had dismissed Beatrice before hearing her speak. He assumed they would do so again. Beatrice understood something he did not. Powerful men did not need to love her. They only needed to fear being publicly caught defending a criminal. She arrived on Julian's arm but released it before taking her place. Her deep green gown exposed the marked skin along her throat. Her hair was arranged simply, without false pieces disguising the thinning at her temples. Whispers followed her through the room just as they had followed her down the aisle at St. Aldwyn's. This time, she did not lower her eyes. She had spent 12 years being watched without consent. She would rather be watched while telling the truth than hidden while carrying Edmund's shame. Edmund's barrister began by attacking her sanity. He described a grieving girl obsessed with blaming her father for an accident, a difficult woman whose imagination intensified after marriage to a financially desperate duke. Beatrice allowed him to finish. When he cited Harcourt's medical reports, Dr. Reed presented his independent examination and identified injuries consistent with prolonged restraint. A former nurse from Harcourt's private institution produced treatment registers showing that Beatrice had been tied to a bed for periods of up to 14 days. The nurse testified that Beatrice's confinement was extended whenever she asked about Helena's death or demanded access to the trust accounts. Harcourt claimed the measures were necessary because Beatrice suffered violent episodes. Beatrice's solicitor asked him to identify a single injury she caused to another person. He could not. The only recorded violence had been committed against her. Dr. Reed then compared Harcourt's reports for Beatrice with reports written for 7 unrelated women. Entire passages describing inherited female instability were identical, including spelling errors. Harcourt had reused the same diagnosis whenever a wealthy male guardian paid him to confine a woman. When Edmund denied stealing from the maternal trust, Beatrice presented Helena's ledger. 3 handwriting experts verified that Helena had written it. A paper manufacturer dated the pages to the years before her death. Bank clerks matched the coded entries to real withdrawals, and company records revealed that the money passed through businesses controlled by Edmund's allies. Beatrice explained the cipher without hesitation, reading household purchases and translating them into the concealed transactions. What Edmund had called the confused writing of an anxious wife became a precise financial map of his crimes. The missing funds totaled more than enough to destroy him. Some financed failed railways, some purchased political favors. Others went to editors and government officials connected to Robert Vale's disgrace. Julian sat behind Beatrice and said nothing. He understood that public loyalty did not require taking control of her testimony. The investigation into Robert's case followed. Letters between Helena, Robert Vale, and Thomas Arden showed that all three had identified Edmund's sale of advanced tariff information. Government archives contained the original dispatches Robert supposedly leaked. The seals did not match those on the papers printed by the newspaper. Crowther's dispatch case contained invoices for copying the seals and a draft of the forged correspondence. The editor who first published the accusation admitted accepting payment from an Ashcombe account. Robert had delayed exposing Edmund while attempting to secure political protection for himself, a choice the inquiry criticized, but he had never committed treason. Julian listened as his father's name was cleared without being polished into perfection. Robert remained a flawed man, but he was no traitor. The distinction mattered. Truth did not require a saint. It required evidence. Margaret Fenwick entered the chamber before Edmund knew she had returned from Scotland. Beatrice had once believed Margaret abandoned her out of shame. Now the older woman crossed the room and stood beside her. She described the threats against her brother and read the account she wrote after Helena's death. Helena had discovered that Edmund and Crowther were gradually substituting her heart medicine with laudanum, hoping to make her confused enough to discredit. On the final night, Margaret saw Crowther carry a new bottle into Helena's room. Helena confronted Edmund in the upper gallery. Margaret heard her say she had sent evidence to Robert Vale and would expose the stolen trust money. Moments later, glass broke. Helena fell. Margaret reached the gallery and found Edmund at the railing. Helena remained alive on the floor below, moving one arm and calling weakly for Beatrice. Edmund ordered the servants not to summon a physician until he had searched Helena's room. By the time help arrived, she was dead. Edmund called Margaret a frightened liar. His barrister argued that no medicine bottle had ever been recovered and that Helena might have fallen because of her existing heart condition. Beatrice then placed a small amber bottle on the evidence table. Investigators found it inside Harcourt's private medical cupboard after his arrest. The label carried a false patient name, but the glass had been purchased by Wycliffe House, and Helena's initials had been scratched into its base. Chemical analysis revealed laudanum mixed with digitalis in proportions that could cause dizziness, muscular weakness, and confusion. Harcourt denied preparing it. Crowther, desperate to avoid a murder charge, interrupted. "I mixed only what Lord Wycliffe ordered. He said it was to frighten her and retrieve the ledger." The chamber erupted. Edmund turned toward his solicitor with naked hatred. That look destroyed the final appearance of unity between them. The chief magistrate pressed Crowther. He admitted altering Helena's medicine, but insisted he was not present when she fell. Margaret reminded him that she saw the bottle in his hand. Crowther changed his account again, claiming Edmund promised that Helena would not be seriously harmed. "You followed her into the gallery," he shouted at Edmund. "You watched her fall." Edmund's control finally broke. "She would not stop," he snapped. "She threatened to expose everything. I warned her to surrender the papers. She stepped backward. The drug made her unsteady." Silence spread through the chamber. The magistrate leaned forward. "Did you push your wife?" "No." "Was she alive after the fall?" Edmund looked at Beatrice. For one moment, she saw not a marquis, but a frightened, selfish man who had spent decades confusing obedience with love. "She was breathing," he admitted. Beatrice's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Why did you delay calling a physician?" She would have spoken. The answer came too quickly for him to reclaim it. "She would have accused me before the servants. I needed the papers found first." Beatrice had imagined many forms of murder. The truth was colder. Edmund had not needed to push Helena. He had drugged her, watched her fall, and chosen his reputation while she lay dying. The magistrates ordered Edmund detained. His private guards attempted to move toward Beatrice, but court officers blocked them. Julian stepped forward only when one man reached inside his coat. The guard was disarmed and arrested. Edmund stared at his daughter as irons closed around his wrists. "You have destroyed everything your mother built." Beatrice stood. "My mother built the evidence that brought you here. You would not have survived without my name. I survived despite it." Edmund was led from Westminster House, while aristocrats who had once competed for his favor turned their faces away. Beatrice expected triumph. Instead, she felt a quiet emptiness. as if a locked door had finally opened onto a room she no longer wished to enter. Julian did not ask whether she was happy. He simply stood beside her. Crowther was charged with fraud, forgery, conspiracy, arson, attempted murder, and participation in Helena's death. Harcourt lost his medical license and faced prosecution for unlawful confinement, falsification of records, and assisting the poisoning conspiracy. Edmund was convicted after a public trial. His political influence collapsed, and the Crown seized assets acquired through stolen trust money. Mr. Pike and the servants involved in the attacks received separate sentences. The man who delivered the poisoned chocolate testified in exchange for a reduced term. The assistant housekeeper avoided prison because she had not known about the poison, but her actions and payments became part of the public record. Beatrice refused requests to hide the woman's name, merely to spare Larkhaven embarrassment. "Secrecy is how my father turned small betrayals into attempted murder," she said. Robert Vale was formally cleared of treason. The government acknowledged that officials accepted bribes to authenticate forged evidence. Julian's mother received the judgment in Blackthorn Abbey's morning room. She read it twice before pressing it to her chest. For the first time in 2 years, she attended Sunday service. Some people still stared, but she walked to the front pew without lowering her head. Lydia's name was cleared as well. When the newspaper responsible for printing the forged accusations offered a private apology, Lydia demanded that it be published on the same page and in the same size as the original story. Beatrice suggested larger letters. The editor complied. Beatrice gained full legal control of Larkhaven and Helena's fortune. Blackthorn's creditors were paid through compensation awarded after Robert's exoneration and through funds recovered from Edmund's fraudulent accounts. Julian restored the estate without accepting a single pound from the marriage bargain that had taken him to St. Aldwyn's. The roof was repaired, tenant mortgages renegotiated, and farmland returned to families Edmund's banks had attempted to remove. Julian opened Robert's surviving correspondence to investigators and historians. He refused to hide the letters showing his father's hesitation and political ambition. "Clearing his name does not require pretending he never failed," he told Lydia. "It requires separating his failures from crimes he did not commit." After the trials ended, Julian asked Beatrice to meet him in Larkhaven's restored music room. The walls had been rebuilt, but Helena's fire-blackened cabinet remained near the window. Beatrice had chosen not to replace the damaged panel. Julian placed 2 documents on a table. One was a petition for annulment. The second was an agreement granting Beatrice complete independence if she preferred legal separation. She read both before looking at him. "Do you wish to leave me?" "No." "Then why prepare these?" "Because the conditions under which you married me were coercive. Your father controlled your freedom, and he used my family's desperation to control me. Now that you are legally independent, you should possess the choice we were both denied." Beatrice touched the annulment petition. "If I sign, you receive nothing from my trust. I know. You would not challenge me?" "No. Even if I kept Larkhaven and never saw you again?" Pain crossed his face, but he answered steadily, "Your choice must matter more than what I want. It always should have." Beatrice carried the annulment petition to the fire. Flames moved through the paper until Edmund's settlement, and every term built upon it became ash. "That is not a legally complete answer," Julian said. "No," she replied. "This is." She returned to him and placed his hand against the marked side of her face. It was the first time she had invited anyone to touch the skin society used as an excuse to dehumanize her. Julian's fingers remained still until she leaned into them. "I choose you," she said. He closed his eyes. "But I will not remain the bride my father transferred into your possession. If we stay married, we make the vows again, under terms we choose ourselves." Julian bent his forehead to hers. "Whatever terms you choose." "We choose," she corrected. "Together." They exchanged new vows in Larkhaven's chapel the following spring. No journalists attended. No money changed hands. No father presided over the ceremony. Lydia stood beside Beatrice, while Nora carried a bouquet tied with the faded blue ribbon Helena had wrapped around the key. Margaret Fenwick returned from Scotland. Dr. Reed and his wife sat with several tenant families whose homes Beatrice had repaired. Julian waited at the altar just as he had at St. Aldwyn's, but this time no crowd had gathered to see him suffer. When Beatrice reached the final step, he extended his open hand. She took it without hesitation. Their promises contained no language of obedience. They vowed honesty, partnership, and the right to speak without fear. Afterward, Beatrice signed her name across a clean page. The pen did not tear the paper. No hand descended upon her shoulder. Marriage did not erase 12 years of trauma. There were nights when Beatrice woke believing she had heard Harcourt's attendants outside the door. Raised voices sometimes sent her body into panic before her mind recognized that no one threatened her. She still checked unfamiliar rooms for exits and could not tolerate a key turning in a lock behind her. Julian never told her the danger was over, as though knowledge alone could command her body to forget. He opened the door. He waited where she could see him. He reminded her where she was and allowed her to decide whether she wanted him closer. Gradually, Beatrice discovered that darkness could be chosen rather than imposed. She decided when candles were extinguished. She decided when Julian entered her bed and when she needed to sleep alone. He never treated earlier consent as a permanent entitlement. In that patience, desire ceased feeling like another form of surrender. Society did not become suddenly kind. Some women continued staring when Beatrice entered a ballroom without covering her face. A few whispered the old names behind their fans, believing distance made cruelty invisible. Men who once mocked her began praising her courage because they wanted to appear as though they had supported her all along. Portrait painters offered to soften the birthmark or add hair at her temples. Beatrice refused. When Larkhaven commissioned her official portrait, she instructed the artist to reproduce every mark accurately, including the scars visible above her gloves. "I will not allow future generations to believe I became worthy only after a painter corrected me." The finished portrait showed Beatrice standing beside Helena's cabinet with the brass key in one hand and the decoded ledger in the other. It did not depict a miraculous transformation. It depicted a woman who had stopped apologizing for being visible. Using part of Helena's recovered fortune, Beatrice founded an independent legal trust for women imprisoned under fraudulent medical diagnoses. No physician accepting payment from a husband, father, or guardian could serve as the sole authority declaring a woman incompetent. The trust provided solicitors, independent examinations, safe housing, and financial audits. Nora became its first administrator. Margaret helped collect testimony from women too frightened to speak publicly. Dr. Reed recruited physicians willing to challenge Harcourt's methods. Within the first 2 years, the trust freed 11 women from private institutions. By the 5th year, that number had grown to 37. Beatrice personally reviewed each case. Whenever a family complained that she was interfering in private affairs, she answered that locked doors stopped being private when they concealed crimes. Lydia eventually married a young barrister who had helped investigate Harcourt's medical records. She made him wait a year before accepting his proposal, explaining that any man seeking entrance into the Vale family ought to demonstrate unusual endurance. Nora married Larkhaven's estate clerk, but refused to surrender her work or her surname. Julian's mother divided her time between Blackthorn and Larkhaven, gradually returning to music, dinners, and public life. The Western farms prospered. Once dishonest fees were removed. Beatrice continued reviewing their accounts because, as Julian complained affectionately, no ledger in England was safe from her. Beatrice and Julian had 2 children. Their daughter Helena inherited Julian's calm expression and Beatrice's refusal to accept an unanswered question. Their son Robert possessed his grandmother's dark eyes and Lydia's talent for creating disorder. Neither child was raised to believe titles made them more valuable than the people working their land. Neither was taught to hide the history of the family. When Helena asked about the scars around her mother's wrists, Beatrice answered in language the child could understand. "Someone once locked me away because I told the truth. Other people helped me open the door." "Did Papa save you?" Helena asked. Beatrice looked toward Julian. "Your father helped me. But I learned to save myself too." Julian smiled, because the distinction mattered. On Helena's 4th birthday, the dining hall at Larkhaven filled with tenants, friends, former patients of the trust, and children running beneath the tables. Beatrice stood near the head of the room. Candlelight warmed the dark mark across her face. Her hair was arranged simply. Her sleeves ended below the elbows, leaving the scars at her wrists visible. She no longer positioned her body to occupy less space. Julian came to stand beside her. "You are thinking again. I have been accused of it. Repeatedly and with considerable evidence." Beatrice watched their daughter attempting to convince Lydia that 4 birthday candles required 4 separate cakes. I was remembering St. Aldwyn's. Julian's expression tightened. Why give that morning space tonight? Everyone came to watch you suffer for marrying me. They were terribly disappointed. Were they? Completely. I have suffered much more from your account books than from your appearance. She laughed. Julian still listened for the sound, though it had long since ceased being rare. Across the hall, Nora scolded a footman for allowing Robert near the punch bowl. Margaret laughed beside the fire. The doors to the summer terrace stood open. Beatrice sometimes thought of the 17-year-old girl locked inside Wycliffe House and told that certainty was madness. She remembered repeating what she heard between Helena and Edmund, even after every repetition brought another punishment. She did not resent that frightened girl or consider her weak. That girl had protected the truth when no adult protected her. She had endured long enough to find the sewing box, stitch a key against her heart, and walk through a church filled with people who wanted her ashamed. Julian placed one hand on the table between them, palm upward, exactly as he had at the altar. Even after years of marriage, he offered rather than assumed. Beatrice placed her hand in his. London had called her the ugliest daughter in England. Physicians had called her unstable. Her father had called her ungrateful. Society had called Julian desperate for choosing her, then heroic when it became fashionable to praise what it had once mocked. Beatrice required none of their words. She possessed her mother's truth, her own name, a husband who never confused love with ownership, and a home whose doors opened at her command. The brass key that once cut into her skin remained inside a glass case beside Helena's restored cabinet. Beneath it, Beatrice placed a single engraved sentence. A locked door is powerful only until the prisoner remembers she was born with a voice. She had been brought to St. Aldwyn's as a woman her father intended to trade, silence, and eventually bury. She left the story as the Duchess of Blackthorn, the woman who exposed a murderer, restored an innocent family, freed dozens of imprisoned women, and transformed a marriage purchased through desperation into a love chosen without fear. The world continued to see the mark upon her face. Beatrice finally understood that it had never been the ugliest thing in the room.